They believed distance meant safety. By January 1945, Soviet tank commanders were certain of one thing. Anything beyond a kilometer was irrelevant. German anti-tank guns couldn't reach that far anymore. If they could be seen, they could be destroyed. And if they couldn't be seen, they didn't exist. That assumption was wrong. Somewhere east of Warsaw, Soviet tanks were being destroyed one by one. Not by aircraft, not by artillery barrages, not by another armored unit, but by something they never searched for. The shots didn't come from the tree line in front of them. They didn't come from flanking positions. They didn't even come from the distance Soviet doctrine considered dangerous. They came from far beyond it. Crews turned their turrets toward empty forest. Infantry jumped from tanks, exposing themselves to nothing, and dying anyway. Searchlights swept the snow, illuminating everything except the threat itself. Every response was logical. Every decision followed training. And every one of them made things worse. Because this wasn't a battle of numbers. It wasn't even a battle of firepower. It was a battle of assumptions. And the Soviets were never prepared for what was hitting them. From a distance, they believed was impossible. If you want to understand how wars are shaped not by numbers, but by assumptions, stay with us. By early 1945, the Red Army was advancing with confidence. Years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front had taught Soviet commanders hard lessons, and those lessons had solidified into doctrine. Distance was safety. Momentum was protection. And German anti-tank defenses, once feared, were now considered a shrinking threat. This belief did not come from arrogance alone. It came from experience. Most German anti-tank guns still in service were effective only within predictable ranges. If a gun could be seen, it could be suppressed. If it could not be seen, it could not reach far enough to matter. Soviet tank crews were trained accordingly. Columns moved with spacing. Turrets scanned forward and to the flanks. Infantry rode on armor, trusting steel and speed to carry them through exposed terrain. And above all, Soviet doctrine assumed one critical rule. Beyond a certain distance, no German gun could engage effectively. That assumption shaped everything. Routes were selected based on visibility, not concealment. Forests were dangerous only at close range. Long, straight roads were considered manageable, even preferable, because threats could be detected early. What Soviet commanders did not account for was the possibility that the danger zone itself had shifted. They were not looking for a gun they believed should not exist. By January 1945, German industry was collapsing, fuel was scarce, and ammunition shortages were constant. From the Soviet perspective, the enemy was retreating, improvising, and losing the ability to contest open ground. What remained of German resistance was expected to rely on mines, close-range ambushes, or desperate last stands. Not precision, not patience, and certainly not long-range dominance. That was the blind spot. Because somewhere east of Warsaw, German forces were no longer trying to stop Soviet advances everywhere. They were choosing where to fight, and more importantly, where not to be seen. Instead of building defenses meant to survive detection, they were creating systems designed to avoid it entirely. This was not about holding territory. It was about disrupting certainty. A single concealed weapon, placed correctly, could do more psychological damage than an entire battery firing openly. If Soviet commanders could not determine where the threat was coming from, they could not respond proportionally. And if they responded incorrectly, they exposed themselves further. The Red Army's strength had always been coordination. Tanks, infantry, artillery, air power, all moving as one system. But systems fail when one input is wrong. And the input that failed here was range. Soviet crews were trained to fear what they could see. They were not trained to fear what lay far beyond their visual horizon. They did not scan forests for threats at extreme distances. They did not calculate trajectories that exceeded known German capabilities. They did not imagine that a single hidden gun could dictate the behavior of an entire armored formation. That gap between belief and reality was not accidental. It was engineered. Because the weapon waiting in those frozen forests was not meant to win battles through firepower alone. It was designed to break assumptions, to hit targets that believed themselves untouchable. And once that belief collapsed, everything else followed. Confusion replaced coordination. Caution replaced momentum. And the very doctrine that had carried Soviet armor across Eastern Europe began working against it. The Soviets were advancing into a battlefield they thought they understood. But the rules had changed, and they had never prepared for that. What the Soviets were facing was not simply a gun hidden in the forest. It was a system designed around invisibility. Most anti-tank weapons relied on proximity. They waited for armor to come close, exposed themselves briefly, fired, and then paid the price. Counterfire, artillery, air observation, detection was inevitable. This system worked differently. The weapon itself was only one component. What mattered more was how it reshaped the battlefield before the first shot was ever fired. At extreme distances, visual detection breaks down. Tank crews cannot distinguish movement from shadow. Optics lose detail. Depth perception collapses into guesswork. Beyond a certain range, even trained observers stop looking, not because they are careless, but because doctrine tells them there is nothing worth seeing. That was the advantage. A concealed long-range cannon did not need camouflage to defeat sight. Distance did that on its own. By positioning the weapon far beyond expected engagement ranges, German planners shifted the problem from concealment to disbelief. Soviet crews were not missing the threat. They were excluding it. This changed every calculation. A shot fired from close range invites immediate retaliation. A shot fired from extreme distance creates uncertainty. Where did it come from? Was it a single gun or several? Was it fixed or mobile? Was it even artillery at all? Every second spent answering those questions was a second of exposure. The system relied on patience rather than volume. It did not attempt to stop an advance outright. It aimed to fracture it. One vehicle disabled at the front forced those behind to halt or maneuver. A second hit confirmed that the threat was not accidental. By the third, doctrine began to unravel. Turrets rotated toward empty forest. Infantry dismounted prematurely. Search patterns expanded in the wrong directions. Each reaction made sense in isolation. Together, they created chaos. What made the system especially dangerous was its restraint. Limited ammunition imposed discipline. Targets were chosen, not engaged impulsively. Only vehicles that shaped the movement of the entire formation were prioritized. The goal was not destruction, it was disruption. At long range, even a single hit carried disproportionate psychological weight. Crews could not hear the firing sequence clearly. There was no visible muzzle flash, no identifiable firing position. To the Soviet crews inside their tanks, destruction appeared sudden and arbitrary, and randomness is terrifying. As Soviet commanders escalated their response, the system anticipated them. Increased spacing reduced coordination. Searchlights revealed terrain, but also silhouetted the searchers themselves. Heavier tanks were deployed under the assumption that armor thickness would compensate for uncertainty. But armor does not solve a problem it cannot locate. The unseen system exploited this perfectly. It did not challenge Soviet firepower head-on. It invited overreaction. Every added layer of response increased complexity. Every added asset required coordination under stress. And every failure reinforced the belief that something fundamentally new was happening. That belief was more damaging than the losses themselves. Because once Soviet commanders accepted that their assumptions about range and safety were wrong, they were forced into a defensive mindset, even while advancing. Momentum slowed, confidence eroded, and formations that should have pressed forward began behaving as if they were already under siege. The weapon remained concealed not because it was hidden well, but because the battlefield had been redesigned around it. The forest, the distance, the timing, the restraint, all of it served the same purpose: to ensure that when the Soviets finally understood what they were facing, they would already be reacting too late. And that was exactly what the system was built to achieve. The first destruction did not look like an ambush. There was no visible enemy movement, no buildup of fire, no warning signs that Soviet crews had been trained to recognize. One moment, the formation was advancing as planned. The next, a vehicle at the edge of the column was simply no longer operational. To Soviet commanders, this mattered more than the loss itself. A tank destroyed at close range could be explained. A tank disabled by artillery could be mapped. Air attack followed recognizable patterns. But this did not fit any of them. The distance alone created confusion. No German unit should have been able to engage from that far. And yet the damage was unmistakable. Penetration, internal detonation, catastrophic failure. The immediate response followed doctrine. Turrets rotated forward. Gunners searched tree lines. Infantry prepared to dismount. Nothing was found. Seconds passed. Then another vehicle was hit. At that point, the problem shifted from tactical to psychological. Two impacts confirmed intent. This was not stray fire. It was deliberate. But deliberate from where? Soviet commanders attempted to localize the threat. Fire discipline was ordered. Search patterns were tightened. And this is where the first real failure occurred. Doctrine assumed the enemy was closer than reality allowed. By focusing attention on near and mid-range threats, Soviet crews unintentionally exposed themselves. Hatches opened for visibility. Infantry dismounted into open terrain. Vehicles slowed to reestablish control. Each of these actions reduced protection. Each of them made sense, until the next shot landed. At long range, the weapon did not need speed. It did not need volume. It only needed patience. Another tank was disabled. Now panic began to spread. Radio traffic increased sharply. Orders overlapped. Different units reacted to different assumptions about the threat. Some commanders believed they were facing artillery. Others suspected anti-tank guns concealed near the road. A few assumed a larger German armored force was operating unseen. None of these explanations were correct. And that uncertainty fractured coordination. Vehicles that should have advanced together began maneuvering independently. Spacing widened. Mutual support broke down. Instead of a single armored system, the formation became a collection of isolated targets. The unseen system exploited this immediately. Targets were no longer selected for proximity, but for influence. A tank positioned to command a route. A vehicle attempting to reposition others. A unit trying to restore order. Each time such a vehicle was struck, confusion multiplied. What made the situation worse was the lack of feedback. There was no visible enemy to fixate on, no muzzle flash to suppress, no pattern that could be anticipated. Every response created new exposure. As panic spread, Soviet units began to overcorrect. Some tanks reversed suddenly, blocking those behind them. Others accelerated forward, separating from infantry support. Several turned their turrets continuously, tracking threats that were never there. The battlefield became noisy, chaotic, inefficient. This was exactly what the system required. The destruction itself was limited. The disruption was not. Commanders called for heavier assets. Requests for air observation and artillery support were transmitted, but even those measures faced a problem. They required a target. Without one, firepower became irrelevant. The Red Army had overwhelming strength on paper. In practice, that strength depended on certainty. Certainty of enemy position, range, and intent. That certainty was gone. The unseen weapon did not force retreat through brute force. It forced hesitation. And hesitation in a mechanized formation is lethal. As Soviet commanders attempted to regain control, they unknowingly reinforced the original error. They assumed that the solution lay in escalation rather than reconsideration. More armor, more movement, more searching. But none of it addressed the core issue. They were responding to a threat they did not understand, using rules designed for a battlefield that no longer existed. And with every minute that passed, the psychological weight of the unknown grew heavier. Crews began to expect the next impact. They waited for it. That anticipation slowed reactions. It dulled coordination. It turned trained soldiers into cautious individuals. The first shock had passed. What remained was something far more dangerous. Fear of an enemy that could strike without being seen, from a distance that should have been safe. At that moment, Soviet doctrine had not yet collapsed, but it had begun to work against itself, and the system was ready to push it further. Once uncertainty entered the formation, escalation felt inevitable. From the Soviet perspective, the problem could not be small. Losses occurring at extreme distance suggested either a new class of weapon or a coordinated enemy force operating beyond visual range. Both interpretations demanded the same response: more power. The first adjustment was spacing. Vehicles widened their intervals, attempting to reduce vulnerability to follow-up fire. On paper, this reduced the chance of multiple losses from a single engagement. In reality, it weakened mutual support. With greater distance between vehicles, coordination slowed. Radio communication replaced visual cues. Reaction times increased, and isolated tanks became easier to influence psychologically. The second adjustment was movement. Instead of maintaining momentum, columns began to pause, advance, stop again, then reposition. Each pause was intended to restore control. Each pause instead created a window of exposure. The unseen system did not need those windows to be long. It only needed them to exist. As daylight faded, Soviet commanders introduced a new variable: darkness. Night movement was supposed to reduce vulnerability. Limited visibility, they believed, would neutralize whatever long-range advantage the enemy possessed. But darkness did not blind the unseen system. It blinded the search. Without a clear reference point, crews could no longer determine where danger might originate. They compensated with illumination. Searchlights were deployed. Powerful beams swept across frozen roads, tree lines, and snowbanks, cutting sharp cones of white through the night. From inside a tank, this felt reassuring. Anything illuminated could be engaged. What the crews did not realize was that illumination worked both ways. Searchlights revealed movement and intent. They marked command vehicles. They highlighted the most active elements of the formation. They also created contrast, turning darkness into a weapon. A concealed system operating beyond visual engagement range did not need to see clearly. It only needed to know where attention was focused. The introduction of searchlights narrowed Soviet perception instead of expanding it. As escalation continued, heavier armor was brought forward. If lighter tanks were vulnerable, then heavier ones would be the answer. Vehicles with thicker armor, stronger guns, and greater survivability were expected to stabilize the situation. From a doctrinal standpoint, this was logical. Armor absorbs uncertainty. Mass restores confidence. But armor does not correct false assumptions. Heavier tanks required tighter movement corridors. They maneuvered more slowly. They demanded greater logistical coordination. And most critically, their presence signaled desperation. The unseen system did not need to destroy every vehicle. It only needed to influence behavior. Each escalation reinforced the belief that the threat was growing, and that belief alone was enough to slow the advance. The battlefield began to operate on two timelines. On one timeline, Soviet formations continued pushing westward, fulfilling operational objectives. On the other, they were reacting moment to moment to a threat they could not locate. Those timelines conflicted. Orders became conditional. Movement became cautious. Aggression became selective. The unseen system exploited this tension. It did not respond to every escalation. Sometimes it waited. Silence after a heavy response was more unsettling than immediate contact. It suggested restraint, calculation, intelligence. The implication was clear. Whatever was causing the losses was still in control. This created a feedback loop. The more the Soviets escalated, the more they revealed their priorities. The more they revealed, the easier it became to predict their reactions. At no point did Soviet commanders truly regain initiative. They were reacting to effects rather than causes. They were attempting to suppress a threat that refused to behave like one. By now, the formation was no longer thinking in terms of advance. It was thinking in terms of survival, and that shift marked a turning point. Because the unseen system was never designed to win through attrition. It was designed to create behavioral collapse. Every added layer of response introduced new vulnerabilities. Every added asset increased complexity under stress. And complexity under fire is fragile. At the height of escalation, Soviet commanders believed they were finally closing in. Search patterns tightened. Movement slowed. Attention narrowed. What they did not see was that the system had already reached its objective. The advance had been disrupted. Confidence had eroded. Doctrine had been stretched beyond its limits. From that point on, even the absence of fire carried weight. Every kilometer forward was taken with caution. Every pause invited fear of another unseen strike. The escalation had not eliminated the threat. It had amplified it. And the longer the Soviets remained trapped inside that loop, the more the battlefield worked against them. Escalation always carries a cost. For the Soviets, that cost appeared in confusion and hesitation. For the concealed system, it appeared somewhere else entirely. Ammunition. This was never a weapon designed for sustained fire. It could not overwhelm by volume. It could not afford mistakes. Every round represented a calculation. Is this target worth revealing our presence again? Will this shot change the behavior of the entire formation? Or will it simply confirm what the enemy already suspects? At extreme range, precision is not a luxury. It is a necessity. The unseen system operated under a constraint the Soviets never fully understood: scarcity. Each engagement forced a decision not about capability, but about timing. Firing too early wasted opportunity. Firing too late risked discovery. The system could not react emotionally to escalation. It had to remain selective. That selectivity shaped the battlefield. Targets were chosen not for proximity, but for influence. A command vehicle. A tank attempting to reorganize others. A unit whose destruction would fracture coordination. Every successful hit magnified uncertainty, but every shot also narrowed the margin for error. This imposed discipline. While Soviet commanders escalated outward, adding armor, light, movement, the unseen system escalated inward. It reduced its own tolerance for risk. This created a quiet tension beneath the visible chaos. From the Soviet perspective, the threat appeared limitless. Shots arrived unpredictably. Losses seemed detached from cause. From the system's perspective, time was running out. The paradox was cruel. The more effective the system became, the closer it moved to exhaustion. Success accelerated limitation. That reality forced restraint. There were moments when firing would have been easy. Exposed vehicles, clear lines of sight, tempting opportunities. But restraint preserved control. The system did not exist to destroy everything in its path. It existed to shape behavior. By forcing Soviet formations to slow, hesitate, and misallocate resources, it achieved disproportionate effect without proportional firepower. And that effect did not require constant engagement. Silence became a tool. Each pause suggested intent. Each delay implied calculation. Each unanswered escalation deepened uncertainty. The Soviets could not know how many rounds remained. They could not know if the threat had withdrawn or was waiting. That ambiguity was powerful. When the system did fire again, it did so with purpose, not to prove presence, but to reinforce consequence. Every shot had to justify its cost. Because once ammunition was exhausted, the system would lose its only advantage. At that point, concealment alone would not be enough. This forced a final set of decisions. Continue engagement and risk discovery, withdraw and preserve the system, or adapt in a way the enemy could not anticipate. The unseen system did not survive by firepower alone. It survived by knowing when to stop. And that restraint ensured that when the Soviets believed they were finally closing in, the battlefield would fall silent again. Not because the threat was gone, but because it had already moved beyond reach. From the Soviet perspective, the failure was inexplicable. They had armor, they had infantry, they had artillery, they had reconnaissance, and yet the threat remained untouched. The reason was not lack of effort. It was misidentification. Soviet commanders were not searching for the right kind of enemy. Everything about their response assumed scale. A unit, a battery, a formation large enough to justify the damage inflicted. Search patterns expanded accordingly. Reconnaissance units combed forests for tracks. Artillery scanned for firing signatures. Air observation looked for movement, smoke, or fixed positions. None of those indicators existed. The system they were hunting did not behave like a unit. It behaved like a decision. It appeared only when conditions were optimal. It fired only when the outcome justified the cost. And it moved before the enemy could even agree on what they were chasing. This made countermeasures ineffective. Counter-battery fire depends on origin detection, but at extreme range, acoustic triangulation loses precision. Sound arrives late, distorted by terrain and temperature. Air reconnaissance depends on persistence. But a system that relocates before daylight leaves nothing to observe. Ground search depends on assumptions about proximity, but no one was searching far enough away. The greatest Soviet error was conceptual. They believed the threat must be complex because the effect was significant. In reality, it was the opposite. The system worked because it was simple. One weapon, limited ammunition, carefully chosen terrain. Soviet intelligence interpreted losses as evidence of a hidden force. They reinforced patrols. They widened security perimeters. They allocated resources to counter a threat that existed mostly in their own projections. Every additional asset increased noise. Every new assumption widened the gap between reality and response. By the time Soviet commanders began to suspect a single concealed weapon, the opportunity to locate it had already passed. The system did not need to evade detection indefinitely. It only needed to evade it long enough. Once movement resumed, the battlefield changed again. Routes shifted, formations altered, search priorities moved elsewhere. The threat faded, not because it had been neutralized, but because it had already achieved its purpose. The Soviets never found it because they were never looking for something that small, that patient, and that disciplined. They were hunting an enemy that fought the way they expected. What they faced was something else entirely. When the reports reached higher command, they were treated with caution. Descriptions were inconsistent. Ranges were disputed. The number of weapons involved was unclear. What remained consistent was the tone. Soviet after-action reports did not describe a decisive engagement. They described uncertainty. Vehicles destroyed without warning. Fire arriving from beyond expected limits. An enemy that appeared, struck, and vanished before retaliation could be organized. In intelligence summaries, the language shifted. Not anti-tank gun, not battery, but unknown long-range weapon. That distinction mattered because it acknowledged something deeper than loss. It acknowledged a failure of expectation. The Red Army had prepared for German resistance based on what it believed Germany could still field in 1945. What it encountered did not fit that model. There was no sustained defense to overcome, no strong point to reduce, no formation to encircle, only an absence. As Soviet forces continued westward, the incidents did not repeat in the same place. Routes changed, formations adapted, attention moved on. But the effect remained. Crews scanned forests differently. Commanders hesitated where they once advanced confidently. Distance no longer felt reassuring. The weapon itself did not need to destroy more tanks to succeed. It had already altered behavior. That was its true function, not to halt the advance, not to change the outcome of the war, but to remind an advancing army that certainty is fragile. In later months, references to the encounters became less precise. Details blurred, specifics faded. What remained was a rumor, a ghost gun, a phantom threat, a weapon that could strike from distances no one had prepared for. Whether the crew survived, withdrew, or was eventually destroyed is unknown. Records do not say. And in war, silence often means erasure. But disappearance does not mean failure. The most effective systems are not always the ones that endure. They are the ones that force adaptation and then fade before they can be understood. The Soviets never confirmed what hit them. They never captured the weapon. They never corrected the assumptions that had been broken. And that may have been the point. Because how do you prepare for an enemy you cannot see, for a weapon that only exists at the edge of belief, for a threat that survives by refusing to remain present? You cannot. And that is why, on that frozen stretch of road east of Warsaw, the Soviets were never prepared for what struck them. From a distance, they believed was impossible. History doesn't always remember what mattered most. That's why we tell these stories. Subscribe to Epoch Battlefield Bureau for World War II documentaries that reveal how wars were truly fought.